Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Energy Policy in the European Union, Outlook on the German Presidency. We are grateful to both of our moderators, Drs. Aaron Practineau and Reinhard Haas, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. We are also grateful for this combined webinar between the German and Austrian affiliates of IAEE. We thank you very much. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find at our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderators. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderators, Dr. Reinhard Haas, Professor of Energy Economics, Vienna University of Technology, Austria, and Aaron Practineau, Professor of Energy Resources and Innovation Economics at RWTH Aachen University. Aaron, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave, for this introduction. GE, the German affiliate of the IAE, is very proud to present this webinar jointly with its Austrian sister, AAEE, with Reinhard Haas being here as moderator also. Today's webinar is on the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is a very ambitious initiative of the European Union to lead Europe to climate neutrality in 2050. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, declared that this European Green Deal will be Europe's man on the moon moment. And with these ambitions, there are high expectations also for the German presidency of the European Council regarding this European Green Deal and the implementation of it. On the German side, there have been intensive discussions on this topic, and a significant contributor to these discussions from the German side is the Independent Expert Commission, which is tasked by the German government of Chancellor Angela Merkel with the assessment of the German energy transition. And yeah, so we are very, very happy to have Professor Andreas Löschel, who's the chairman of the Independent Expert Commission, and Georg Erdmann, who's former president of the IAEE and former member of this Independent Expert Commission, with us for the discussion. And we will today discuss 3 topics. The first one will be CO2 based energy pricing reforms. The second one will be thinking the Green Deal internationally. And the third topic will be the industrial transformation. Reinhard, I pass the word to you to say a few words also.
Thank you, Aaron. I think we do not have so much time to tell different other stories. I suggest that we try to move quickly into the presentations and discussions. As Aaron has said, we have 3 topics. The idea is that for every topic we have first the presentation by Andreas, about 7 minutes. He will also provide PowerPoint slides. Next, Georg will respond critically to Andreas' words. And finally, we will have, let's say, also some 7 minutes of discussion. That makes in total 1 hour. And I suggest immediately to start with the first topic, which is CO2 price reform. Many of you may remember that about 20 years ago, we had the discussion in Europe which instrument to implement regarding CO2 reduction. And you may remember we were discussing CO2 taxes, and on the other hand, we were discussing finally the emission trading system. At that point of time, it was decided that at least for the large customer, we will introduce the emission trading system, mainly from my point of view, because the European Union did not have the power to introduce a European-wide tax. And now we are in a position where we might have a new chance for an innovative CO2 pricing system. And I ask Andreas now to present to us the content of this work paper with respect to CO2-based pricing. Andreas.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Aaron and Reinhard. It's a pleasure to introduce here briefly these different topics. As has been already introduced, I'm part of a commission of the German government to monitor the energy transition in Germany. And we do a yearly stock take of the developments in the German climate and energy policy framework, the energy concept. The last report was published 1 year ago, and at that time, Georg Erdmann was still a member of this commission. Today, the commission consists of Veronika Grimm, Barbara Lenz, Fridtjof Steiss, and me. The next report actually is going to be published in December, but given the dynamics in the German policy making with a decision on the coal phase out, with the German hydrogen strategy, with the discussions about the European Council presidency of Germany, we decided that we want to publish a comment in June on, from our perspective, central fields of action for the German energy transition in a European context. And this publication highlights 11 areas where we think the German presidency and as well the energy policy in Europe can or should really focus in order to move ahead in this transformation. Today, I'm not going to talk intensively over these 11 on these 11 different topics. And I think in the invitation you as well can find the text of the report, and there is as well a link to all the reports of the Commission, so you can find a lot of additional material. We decided to focus on 3 topics, which is CO2 priced energy forum, the international perspective of the energy transition. And I'm as well going to talk about industrial transformation at the end. So let me start with this first topic, CO2-based energy price reform. Reinhard has already introduced some thoughts on this, and I would like to start with a short German perspective. As you might have heard, Germany has introduced carbon pricing in the non-ETS sectors just at the end of last year. So we will have a carbon price on transport, on the building sector, on heat in the coming years. And this carbon price is going to be 25 euros and increasing to levels of about 60 euros in the upcoming 5 years. So this is a very interesting development joined with the existing emissions trading system. What we think is important is that we make use of this momentum in CO2 pricing, and this consists then first on securing and tightening a CO2 price path in the EU ETS. That's one of the important parts. but it as well relates to the non-ETS sectors, which are currently regulated in the burden sharing directive by the individual member states. And we think it's a good development to also use carbon prices in these sectors. And then there are different possibilities to evolve further. In the report, we as well highlight the possibility of energy price reform in the non-ETS sectors. That's an upcoming topic, of course, in the European Union to harmonize carbon price signals across member states. And we are convinced that also here we have to move ahead quite fast, because in the recovery packages, as you can see, at least in the German one, the sustainability dimension is not negligible, but of course it's really private money that has to be targeted and directed, and carbon prices are the best instrument to target these large amounts of investment, and that needs a clear price signal. It needs minimum prices in the EU ETS, it needs as well these increased carbon price in the non-ETS sectors.
Andreas, 2 minutes.
Yes, there's another component to this energy price reform, that is the elimination of levies on electricity and the idea of making green electricity cheap. And that's very important, because of course what we want to achieve is decarbonization of the other sectors, and we know that this can be done by higher degrees of electrification of the system. And this electrification is only going to work if electricity, green electricity, is cheap, is affordable. And in the German system, but as well in many other systems, there are high levies, feed-in tariffs, electricity taxes that make electricity increasingly expensive. And by redirecting or rebalancing the energy prices towards more CO2-based system, eliminating these levies, there can be a strong push for sector coupling, as we call it in Germany, and electrification of the other sectors. So both of these elements has to go together, providing the right long-term framework, but as well allowing for more in-depth sector coupling in the different sectors of the European member states.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. Also for the time discipline, we had exactly 7 minutes. And now I ask Georg Erdmann to provide us with his comments to the presentation given by Andreas, and also with respect to this document we are referring to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, we all agree to the idea that CO2 price is the best instrument to reach incentives towards carbon neutrality. But the problem is that the European Union has no institutional means to implement such an idea, because any tax system, which would also be a carbon tax, would also be part of the tax system. Any tax system in the European Union needs an unanimous vote of all 27 member states. And in the 1990s, there was already a discussion in the European Union at that time, much less member states, to introduce an combined energy CO2 tax. And this project failed and resulted in 2005 in developing this emission trade system, which now is the most important instrument of the European Union to reduce CO2 emissions. And to my view, is also relatively successful, because the European Union is able to reach its targets. Why? So it means if we consult the European Union in doing something, we should focus on the cap and trade system. That means not on fiscal instrument, but on quantitative instruments. And if you go into the details, you see that the European Union introduced an energy tax regulation, which minimum electricity tax of 0.1 cents per kilowatt hour. This is virtually nothing. So that means probably the European Union is in the present institutional setting not able to implement something which is really an important or relevant price. What is the reason why we cannot expect all member states to agree with the tax system? To my view, there is the energy price elasticity which differs between rich and poor people, rich and poor countries. And probably poor countries and poor people will suffer more from high energy or CO2 taxes than rich people. And we can see that the consequence of this in the Paris Agreement, which was agreed virtually by all countries in the world, there is even no mentioning of an instrument of emission pricing. And the European Union, this discussion also becomes obvious because which countries are most against CO2 pricing? These are the poorer countries in the East. So the problem is that because the European Union is, the member states are different in terms of income, in terms of social system, in terms of energy system. So it is very difficult to get an unanimous vote in favor of CO2 tax. So what should be done? I think, as Andreas already pointed out, the best strategy would be to develop the cap and trade system further. That means actually the CO2 cap and trade system integrates only 50%, about 50% of CO2 emissions. And of course, it could be possible to increase the sectors which should be subject to this cap and trade system. And one candidate for this increase would be the heating sector. That means if we could include the heating sector, then we could have a lot of the share of CO2 emissions which are subject to this cap and trade system will increase. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Georg. We have now sufficient time for questions from the auditory, and on the bottom of your screen in the middle you have something that is called questions and answers, and you have now the opportunity. All of the 132 participants have the opportunity now to ask questions via this questions and answer button. But I have maybe the first question, and it goes in the direction of, let's say, international pricing. And Georg, you have provided us with a statement on the border adjustments with respect to carbon. Maybe you can shortly focus on this cross-border issue before we start with the questions and answers from our auditory.
Yeah, one of the problems of CO2 pricing is so-called carbon leakage. There are countries in the world which have no CO2 tax or no CO2 pricing system, or even very low CO2 pricing system. So that means energy and CO2 intensive industry risks to move out of Europe towards these countries. And now there is a discussion how to prevent this. And one of these ideas is to introduce the so-called border carbon adjustment. It means put an import tariffs according to the difference of the CO2 tax in the exporting country and the CO2 pricing of the European Union. So this is in principle an idea which is of course good, but unfortunately it means protectionist measure. And my doubt is that if the European Union would start with implementing such an idea, the European Union would open the Pandora's box, because there are so many reasons why to implement protectionist measures. There are so many good reasons or bad reasons to implement protectionist measures that maybe other countries will start to react on the European initiatives of border price adjustment. So I think the best idea to do this is to, from the European point of view, to instead of nationally oriented protectionist proposals, we should discuss ideas that focus on strengthening global CO2 cooperation. And one of these is what is laid down already in the Paris Agreement. That means subsidies. That means the European Union pays subsidies or pays transfers money to those countries and those industries which have high efforts in reducing CO2 emissions. So this creates a cooperation level playing field. It's much better than to go in conflict with trade. And another idea is, that was the paper of Andreas of the Commission mentions in the footnote, the so-called carbon added tax, that probably I have not understood very well, and I think there is a lot of discussion necessary on this topic, but the basic idea is to replace all or part of the value added tax by a so-called carbon added tax. And if you do this, then of course imports are taxed according to domestic production, so there is no discrimination between imports and domestic production because everybody is taxed according to the same rules. Of course, there are some problems, and I think you have to, the problem is first, what is the reliable estimation of the associated carbon emissions associated with imports? Second, what is the institutional limits of the European Union to implement this idea? Again, this argument which I put forward, this is a tax issue which could be very difficult to implement because it would refer to value-added tax. And I can see some problems. Maybe different member states have different value-added tax levels, and probably different imports. And if they earn their money, government earns money from value-added tax or from carbon-added tax, maybe the income from these countries may differ a lot. So there will be a much disharmony in the European, between the different member states, because the present revenue, if you replace the present revenue from value-added tax by a CO2 carbon-added tax, then probably the government incomes of these countries, of these member states, will change significantly, and probably this is the most important problem which is associated with this idea. But I think it's worth to think more about how to implement such an idea.
Okay, Georg, thank you. Now we have 5 questions in the questions and answer box. I will read these 5 questions, and please do not write more questions right now. I will read these 5 questions, and then Andreas and/or Georg will provide an answer. First question is by Sahid Bello. Considering the institutional arrangement, how the institutions can be designed to ensure effective implementation of carbon pricing?
Should I answer?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you need to change the European Union. The European Union is not a state like United States of America. If the European Union gets tax autonomy, then it will be the so-called United Nations, United European Nation. It would be a different character, because if the European Union gets the competences in tax issues, the national parliaments have to give up these competences. So that means the national parliaments will become local parliaments organizing schools and other local issues, but the basic task of the state will go to the European Union. And
okay.
If this happens, then of course you can introduce any tax system. But I think it will be very difficult to get this institutional reform to the European Union.
I think so too. Next
Can I answer as well? Because I think it's an important point. No, at the moment in Europe, there is for all the member states there are obligations under the effort sharing regulation. So every member state has to achieve a certain emission reduction in the sectors outside the ETS. So it's free for the different member states to decide now how they do this, and they are publishing national energy and climate plans, in order to show how they are going to achieve these plans. The German carbon pricing I was talking about is part of the German answer on how to achieve its targets. And at the moment, it's possible that the different member states are also trading obligations outside the emissions trading system in the non-ETS sector. So there is already something like an emissions trading system on a member state level for these sectors implemented. And what is now important is that, of course, all the member states could introduce their own carbon pricing, their own ETS in these non-ETS sectors, or set up national emissions electricity taxes or energy taxes, because that's of course up to them now to do that. The basic idea here is that we move from these individual achievements in a direction where we are combining these efforts, either by an emissions trading system for the non-ETS sectors, by extending the ETS to these other sectors, or by harmonizing the energy taxes. So these are different possibilities to move ahead. And I think one will see some developments probably as well with different speed. So there are some member states that already indicated that they are going to work together on reducing emissions in the non-ETS sectors. And they could form then part of a harmonized emission tax or energy tax system, for example, in the non-ETS sectors in Europe. So we are going to see that evolving, but of course the idea is to move into a more comprehensive system step by step, and probably bottom up as I have described it.
Okay, I suggest that next I took two questions together. They are also related to the tax and subsidy issue. First is, how can a reduction of electricity tax promote CO2 reduction? And from my point of view related to this is, how can we stop subsidizing the use of fossil fuels on an EU level? Georg, you want to start?
Maybe, but
okay.
I think Andreas, you have already.
Okay, the first question, I think, I mean, the electricity tax is not directed to the externality. No, the externality that we are talking about with CO2 pricing is a carbon externality. And an electricity tax, of course, is targeting all electricity production and is therefore not efficient. So therefore, in order to really promote CO2 reduction, I mean, the first instrument of choice is a carbon price. The electricity tax, as I said, is the idea is to reduce electricity taxes in the same way in order to make this sector coupling idea possible. But the fossil generation is, of course, heavily priced via CO2 prices. So it's not a burden on green electricity, it's a burden on fossil electricity. And that's the basic idea of these energy price reforms. And of course, subsidizing the use of fossil fuels is part of it. So we have this discussion of course as well. First step would be to really go into the different subsidies that we are providing, and it doesn't make sense, of course, to price on the one hand and subsidize on the other hand. So harmonizing the energy pricing system, of course, is then the first step, and that relates to many activities in Germany. If you go to kerosene and so forth.
Yeah, the first thing, the subsidized European Union has a strong instrument to reduce subsidization because there is this competition authority which can say there is an unfair structure for trade within the European Union. If one country subsidizes too much, then this industry which is subsidized has a competitive advantage towards other member states, to the industry in other member states, and the European Union is trying to inhibit this. So that means the European Union has a strong instrument to reduce subsidizing. I don't think that is a problem from the institutional point of the European Union. Reduction of electricity tax is not so much electricity tax, which is critical, but it's all the levies and charges on electricity. In many countries, the build-up of renewable electrical system is financed through a surcharge on electricity, which in Germany is about more than the wholesale market price for electricity today. So, and the result is that electricity price for customers is very high. And of course, a lot of other problems associated with this. So if you want to reduce, if we want to introduce a CO2 price, we have always the discussion that there may be a social compensation problem. The poor people have to pay more taxes relative to their income than the rich people. But if you reduce the levies on electricity, then you reduce the cost for poor people more strongly than the relative to the income. So that means you create a benefit to the poor people, and this allows you to introduce a national CO2 tax without much objection. So therefore, the combined two things means reducing electricity levy and creating a CO2 surcharge on the other side, which may be from a budgetary point of view relatively equal. This is neutral for many, many people. Maybe there are some exceptions, but then you can treat these families or these poor households individually. Maybe these are families which have very inefficient house. They heat too much and they may heat with coal, or they have to travel long distances by car because there's no public transportation available. So they would suffer from such a reform. And you can say if they are poor and they are suffering, then you can do something in order to help them. So this is an idea to reduce not so much electricity tax, because it's not really relevant. Relevant is the levies for financing renewable electricity, which in Germany is actually more than 6 cents per kilowatt hours. There are expectations that next year it will be 8 cents per kilowatt hours. So a huge amount of money. And therefore there is a discussion to reduce these levies on electricity and of course refinance the money through a surcharge on CO2. So this makes a lot of sense. And it makes also a lot of sense because we want to use electricity as an instrument for making our economy green. We can use renewable electricity for many purposes, from driving to heating, etc. So that means we can use green electricity by replacing fossil fuels. And of course, if electricity is exposed to high levies and costs, then this change will be more complicated.
Okay, thank you. And now we have one last question here. I have also tried to give some answers already via the questions and answer instrument. And the last question is regarding carbon price floor. The question is, do you see merit for a carbon price floor in the EU ETS to guide investments? And could this price floor then also be useful as anchor price for the global coordination problem, including the cross-border carbon adjustment?
Good question.
Okay, this is the answer.
Well, I think that's actually an important part of these long-term framework, having a price floor on carbon prices. When we talk with industry, we see that uncertainty is a much bigger problem than the carbon prices as such. So, providing here some right framework, some investment framework in the longer term, I think is really important. And the carbon price floor provides this. It's as well internationally indeed better to negotiate about these prices than potentially the quantity constraints that are introduced over the national determined contributions, where it's quite complicated to understand what are really comparable efforts. And so there are quite some arguments for introducing these carbon price floors, even though it's of course breaking with the idea of quantity-based regulation, but well, waiting in these longer term perspective, I think it's something to consider, especially given that the market stability reserve at the moment, I think, is not really providing this longer term perspective. It's quite difficult to understand, and I think it's as well better to move away from these, again, quantity-based instrument, the market stability reform, more to easier price signals.
Yeah, why the European Union, with its last CO reform of its emission trade system, introduced a market stability reserve and not a floor price of CO2. Simply because a floor price of CO2 is a tax instrument, and there is no possibility to implement this without an unanimous vote of all member states. And we have the Eastern European countries which are strongly opposed against this minimum price, and therefore the European Union has no chance to implement this idea. And in order to move ahead, they developed this idea of the market stability reserve. In spite of all these bottlenecks and these shortcomings this instrument has, but there is actually no alternative with the present institutional setting of the European Union to go in the direction of quantitative measures instead of price measures, unfortunately.
Okay, Andreas, would you like to add something?
I think already I think added something. I guess Georg is right, but of course we are talking about what the European presidency should promote, as ideas, and I think they should really think about how to develop this further. And we know that there are all types of compensatory ideas, how to as well bring in other member states, to undersign these ideas, and I think you have to be just pushing for it.
Okay, thank you very much, both. We have already also answered the questions and answers. And to sum it shortly up, I think we are not so far away from each other.
No.
Okay, so to the second topic, I hand over to Aaron. Aaron, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Reinhard, Andreas, and Georg. The second topic we are about to discuss now is thinking the Green Deal internationally. So not only focused on a local or continental level, national level, but to expand the thought of the European Green Deal. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. For the international dimension of the energy transition, I would like to talk briefly about three of the topics that we have elaborated in our comments. The first is the enhance of European value added, ensure international integration, align certification with the Green Deal, and then intensify the activation of private capital for green finance. So these are topics that I think are all under this umbrella of the international dimension, and we already heard from Georg that this is of course a crucial part of the global energy transition, because Europe is of course not acting alone. We are integrated in international value chains, and it's getting with the corona crisis also obvious that we have to think about how we can in the long run secure competitiveness of European companies, how we can strengthen the European markets, and how we can probably also divide critical dependencies through diversification. So thinking about these global value chains is getting more and more important, and it as well creates new challenges. If you think about, for example, green hydrogen or synthetic energy carriers, where we know that that international cooperation agreements, trade agreements, are going to be substantial. And Georg was already asking for these energy corporations, and I think that's a very important point. On the other hand, we see that there is different speed in international climate policy, and therefore I think it's important not only to monitor what we are doing here in Germany or in Europe, but as well to look on a global scale and really see how other countries are approaching climate neutrality. And these international climate policy monitoring is of course as well a substantial necessity for any global achievements in climate policy. And what you need for that is you need a better certification of products and processes. So you need some uniformly agreed certification of carbon footprints for imported goods, but as well for financial products. That's the discussion about the EU taxonomy in order to be able to act in terms of policies. This certification is a prerequisite for border carbon adjustment, as we've heard it, so adjusting carbon prices at the border. But we as well heard there's another possibility, carbon added taxes. But in the carbon added taxes, you're not pricing at the border, but you are pricing domestically. But also for this measure, you need an agreed measure of the carbon footprint of the products. So this is really important. We have just published our European hydrogen strategy. There's as well a German hydrogen strategy. All these requires as well an assessment and an agreed assessment of the CO2 content of imported hydrogen. We are going to import a large fraction of hydrogen in Europe, but as well in Germany. And I also talked about the need for increasing private capital. Private capital is the bulk of investments, 90% of investments in the energy transition. So we have to think about how we can use, for example, the EU taxonomy on sustainable investment in order to shift investments into sustainable assets. So this, I think, is extremely important, and it will help now to as well push ahead the European energy transition. So effective footprints, the EU taxonomy, and some international measures, including energy corporations, but as well something like carbon added taxes or border carbon adjustments to align our efforts internationally.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Georg,
okay. I will focus on one topic, namely the so-called CO2 certification. We have some weeks ago, there was a paper from William Nordhaus, who proposed fixed import tariffs instead of border carbon adjustments. And the fixed import tariffs, probably they depend on the difference of the carbon price in the exporting countries and the carbon price in the importing countries. And the reason why William Nordhaus proposed this is because he recognized the complexity to do CO2 certification. Why this is complex? Because there is a manifold of value change, and these value change are changing very fast. So that means if you have a CO2 certification, it is very complex. You need models in order to calculate this, and these models may be wrong or may be right. And if you have decided, then probably there will be an intervention of interest group to change the system a little bit in favor of their own interest. And at the end, as the value change will change, we want to have this industrial transition towards net zero. So that means in the dynamics, and we will have probably higher dynamics in economic change, then probably certification is a task which will not be very reliable and solid. And we have a lot of examples when the energy policy focuses on something like a CO2 certification and creates even adverse results. And I will give you some examples. One is the renewable electricity in Germany. Of course, it is green, But if you trade this renewable electricity, then it cannot be green by law, because if it is subsidized by or supported from government aid, then it becomes gray. So that means, according to the present regulation in Germany, it is the average CO2 content of electricity which is included in the wind energy or in the photovoltaic. Is this the right model? Yes or no? It is, of course, questionable what is the right application. Second example, battery electric vehicles. Of course, they use electricity. Electricity today in Europe, it is not 100% renewable. So probably some of this electricity comes from fossil fuels. In spite of this, the European Union regards these vehicles as being CO2 neutral. In addition, the European Union calculates these vehicles double or 3 times. So that means they are not CO2 neutral, but they are regarded even more than CO2 neutral. And another models, if you include the production of the batteries and the vehicle, then it turns out that maybe small scale vehicles, subcompact vehicles with gasoline or diesel are, from an environmental point of view, from a greenhouse gas point of view, better than a large Tesla car with battery. Another example is heat produced from combined heat and power. Again, you need certification for this. What is the CO2 content of the heat produced from gas-fired combined heat and power? Of course, the result depends on what electricity is replaced by this CO2, by this combined heat and power station. Is it nuclear? Is it coal? Or what it is? And of course, these figures, these numbers which you give, they are probably always wrong. So that means the belief that with certification you can solve any climate thing, it is probably misleading. I think it is better to avoid a large modeling calculus of this, because I think we will not reach climate neutrality if we focus our energy in doing certification.
Thank you very much for your presentations. Are there any questions from the audience on this second topic? Maybe I can start with a question to Andreas. Georg mentioned the difficulties on the consensus regarding a methodology for green certification. What is your opinion on this issue?
Yeah, of course, that's very difficult, no? But without a general agreement on this topic, I think we are not going to move anywhere, no? So all the instruments, and that was the basic point that we are considering, in its core, need some of this type of information. And I think it would be wise to think a little bit deeper how this can be developed, and that is what the EU Commission is currently doing with the taxonomy. So trying to think about what are the carbon impacts in the different activities of industry. But I think we should really discuss, and of course there are a lot of open issues. In this is very often some type of life cycle assessments where there are all cutoff points that are problematic. We know that is very time and region specific. So this has to be discussed, but in the end, of course, we will need some type of yardstick to compare, and this will not be the only thing that we are going to do, but this will be a necessary ingredient. And I think, of course, we can start to think more deeply if we look at processes that are, for example, less complicated. That are not so diverse in terms of their value chain, so it might be easier to start with these things in order to develop this type of taxonomy, and then move on from there. And of course, it's going to be a long-term step. But of course, if we are discussing now, we are going to move now to the hydrogen strategy. It's it's clear now that you have to come up now with some idea what hydrogen is actually that you're importing, and this has to be factored in these long-term planning, no, and the NDCs and all that.
Yeah, I could just comment. Of course, this certification is a substitute if we don't have a CO2 price. If we have a unifying CO2 price in the European Union, we don't need certification because the prices of the CO2 emissions are included in the system. The CO2 emissions are of each installation, each element in the value chain is taxed according to its CO2 content. Then you have no problem to do certification. It is simply the certification, the discussion of certification is a substitute if you believe it is not possible to implement a CO2 price in the European Union.
Well, it's a substitute if you don't implement it globally. No, it's always only then if you have a sub-global solution, whatever this is. No, you always have to deal with it. And of course, I mean, you mentioned Nordhaus. I mean, Nordhaus in his climate club's idea, I think he's indeed moving away from what you just what we just discussed from these certification problems, but he's of course using a much stronger stick, by directly setting up duties on the non-conforming countries. And given Georg's favorism for free trade, I think that is of course a very strong intervention anyway, to ensure this cooperation. It's even stronger than the one that we were talking about with this border carbon adjustment, because the interference is much bigger. Border carbon adjustment, in any case they have to be very focused, very targeted, capturing only very few processes, and then it's only against regions that are not really having carbon prices, substantial carbon prices.
I would just like to add a short comment or a question. You mentioned Nordhaus. So I know who Bill Nordhaus is. Maybe not everybody knows him, and maybe you can refer a little bit more exactly to which paper or to which statement of Nordhaus you refer.
It is a paper which appeared in Foreign Policy this year.
Well, there's a series of papers where William Nordhaus, who was a Nobel laureate in 2018 for his contributions in cost-benefit analysis of climate policy, using his model framework DICE, which is a cost-benefit analysis tool to elaborate on optimal climate policies. And he was discussing this problem of sub-global climate coalitions and possibilities to stabilize these coalitions. And he labeled climate clubs. So clubs that are having substantial efforts in reducing climate change, and so they are forming a coalition without any duties within the climate club, but they are punishing all the other countries that are not going along with climate policy. And there's a series of papers in the AER before 2016. Georg was referring to a recent one in foreign policy.
Thank you. This also answers the first question from the audience on the reference of the Nordhaus paper. The next question from the audience is, how do you propose that we could agree in the European Union for the certification of renewable electricity? And how are we going to advance towards a more unified market that allows the European Union to generate more electricity where the renewable resource is more available without this agreement? So how do you propose that we could agree in the European Union for the certification of renewable electricity?
I can answer this.
Yes, please.
Actually, we have no European single market for renewable electricity. We have a European market for electricity, but not for renewable electricity. Each member state has its individual support system. And if you are, for example, a Dutch wind wind electricity producer, you cannot sell your electricity easily to Germany as being green, and you will not get the support of the German system. So that means the European Union is split into 27 national markets. And of course, one idea which I think should be easily to be implemented is to create a European single market for renewable electricity. Of course, why it is necessary? Because the European Court of Justice had in the recent years 3 times decided that it is not discriminatory if, for example, the German system is not available, the German support system for renewable electricity not available to neighboring countries. And of course, the arguments is a little bit crazy of the European Court of Justice, but of course the politics could react on these decisions and say, we want to have this because it is simply because if you have a single European market for renewable electricity, you have a lot of benefits. One, of course, the investment into renewable electricity will become cheaper because the allocation of renewable electricity will be more in locations which are optimal. Second, probably these locations will be in the southern part of parts of Europe. That means in those parts which are heavily touched by this Corona crisis. That means a single European market for renewable electricity will automatically help to re-establish the economy in these countries. And of course, if you have a single European market and the system becomes, the renewable electricity system becomes cheaper, then the present money which is available in the national system, if you keep this money, then you will have more renewable electricity. That means it's very simple and obvious that this could be the next step of a European integration in the energy system.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. We have a few more questions open, but I would suggest regarding the time frame that we proceed with our next topic. So I would give the word back to Reinhard.
Thank you, Aaron. So the third topic for today is the acceleration of the industrial transformation to climate neutral production. We have now left 4 official minutes. We may have left about 14 unofficial minutes. So my suggestion is we have the presentation by Andreas and we have the comments by Georg, and then we will try to answer questions and answers just in a written form and not in an oral discussion. This is a, let's say, compromise that we can get to the topic and that you also have the opportunity to raise your questions. Andreas,
yes.
Floor again yours.
Well, thanks a lot. Probably just following up on what Georg mentioned, the increase in renewable generated electric power. That's of course the core of this discussion as well. We are talking now about the industrial transformation that indeed needs much more renewable electricity than we have today. And I think we have seen first steps into a European renewable support system as well. So the European Commission has as well proposed to complement national efforts to support renewables. And I think that is an important thing to move towards European support systems, because we have, of course, as well from a German perspective, much more potentials outside Germany that we would like to, or we need to use in our industrial transformation. So this is the core. And then out of these renewable electricity, we then want to achieve the long-term climate neutrality. And the idea here is efficiency first, electrification second, and synthetic fuels or e-fuels third. But the e-fuels, they will play an important role, and that is especially true for industry in our perspective. That is related to steel production, to fertilizer production, as well well to refineries. And there we are going to see a large change in the upcoming years in the European hydrogen strategy. We see mentioning of 40 gigawatt of electrolyzers in the German hydrogen plan. They foresee 5 gigawatt of electrolyzers by 2030. And that, of course, will require much more renewable electricity than we see today, especially if we also increase our CO2 reduction target in the Green New Deal. So what we need for that is for sure an expansion of infrastructure. That is, of course, another part where governments play an important role because there is another externality, and this externality has to be addressed by the government. So we need major investments, not only in electricity infrastructure, but as well in gas and in hydrogen infrastructure, in charging infrastructure and filling stations, and this has to be developed over the next decades. Again, this is a long-term problem, we need a long-term perspective, and we need integrated planning for that. So this is, I think, very important. Based on existing infrastructure, we have to extend in an integrated way, step by step, and many of these things are probably, as we would say, no regret options. If we think about the industrial transformation, then there is a suite of different instruments on the push side and the pull side. We already talked about ETS, about the non-ETS measures, but of course in this transformation, it's very important to develop or to introduce these different technologies and products into the market. And for that, you need as well research, development, and demonstration. You need training of skilled workers and much more. What we are going to see is a combination of these different approaches, including what we call in Germany Reallabore, who try to implement some of these solutions in small scale that can then be upscaled relatively quickly in the next years to come. We know that in the long term, if we believe in the Paris Agreement and all the states are following their obligations of the 2 degrees and below target, there will be, of course, a large shift as well in industrial production over the whole value chains, and that is going to drive a lot of these developments. It might need as well some support. I already talked about different opportunities to make these happen, like carbon pricing. We are as well in these discussions talk in very specific cases about carbon contracts for difference, which actually make then investments in some of these new technologies viable. And that's, of course, only then necessary when you have large investment needs in the upcoming years. And there are some sectors where capital stocks are transforming very rapidly and locking in old technologies. For example, in the steel sector would have then long-term effects. This would be stranded capital, and thereby we should think about how we are actually moving ahead in these areas. As I said, again, that might be only very small fractions of the economy, but we need to provide there some solutions and make sure that these industrial core, in the German case, I mean, that is really really important for economic policy making, that this industrial core is sustained.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Just a short comment from my side regarding the content of questions and answers. There are now many related to hydrogen. And as an information for all in the auditory, we have thought about hydrogen, and we thought it might not fit together with what we do today. And in addition, the time frame might be too short. So I think we have almost agreed that we will have a similar webinar as we have it today, maybe in 6 weeks or in 2 months, specifically on hydrogen and hydrogen in Europe. So we will not give answers now to these comments and questions regarding hydrogen. And Georg will provide his comments to what Andreas just told us.
And I will not comment hydrogen neither. I could do this, but it would be. Yeah. But there is one issue which I should highlight a little bit. It is, of course, R&D, research and development and demonstration projects like this Real Labore. This is good. The government must do this kind. It is useful to develop knowledge how to solve the climate problem. The problem is, once if this project come to an end, if the support comes to an end, usually the installations which had been built up during these exercises, this demonstration period, they will shut down. So the problem that is not a sustainable approach towards industrial transformation, because except if the government continues somehow sponsoring contract for difference or whatsoever. The problem which I see, if we rely our energy or industrial transformation on subsidies, then probably will not reach a green world or a net zero world, but we reach a situation where the industry develops its business according to rent seeking. We can see this phenomenon in the renewable electricity system in Germany. Actually, we all know that wind and photovoltaics today, even in Germany, is the cheapest form to generate electricity. That means normally the government should stop supporting renewable energy, but it is not doing it. The industry is claiming to continue the support, in spite that it is not necessary anymore. So this is the sign that once if you start to build up industries with support systems, then it will not really work well. So we have a perfect system on an approach to develop a perfect system that is our European cap and trade system. And this, if you reduce the number of available emission rights over time, then you will automatically generate a transformation of the industry towards zero emissions, subject to the fact that the penalties, if an industry is not complying to the system, are sufficiently high. So that means the cap and trade system can only work if the penalty works. And there is very, very little discussion about the penalty of the cap and trade system. There are even no data available, whether how many people have to, how many companies paid this, how much money was collected by this, etc. What is the timing, whether companies went bankrupt because they had to pay for these penalties, etc. So nothing, no discussion, no data, nothing. So I propose to think about this. To improve the cap and trade system, you must think about the penalty system, and then you will have a very efficient and effective system to go to net zero industry without subsidies.
Okay. Thank you, Georg. From my point of view, this was actually a very good final statement. Andreas, would you like to add something?
No, I think that's perfect. This brings us, of course, back to our very first comment on the energy price reform, no? Because that means that you need high carbon prices, no, and low green electricity prices. And then this transformation will happen much swifter than we probably think.
Aaron, some comments from your side? Final comments for today.
No, I just want to thank our speakers, Georg and Andreas, for what I think was a very, very interesting webinar. And I think all four of us can agree on the final statement Andreas also made. As Reinhard already mentioned, we are very sorry that we were unable to deepen the topic of hydrogen during this webinar. However, your questions, your multiple questions on this topic, they support us in our idea to host another webinar in a couple of weeks dedicated to the topic of hydrogen from a European German perspective. Reinhard, do you have further comments?
No, I just wanted also to thank all of you. I think we are on the way to the sustainable energy future. There are some minor things that has to be clarified and justified, but I think we are on a good way. Back to Dave Williams.
Oh, thank you, Ronhard, and thank you, actually, Andreas, Georg, Aaron, Ronhard, for an outstanding webinar. Really, I'm looking forward to the build on to this. Hydrogen, such a hot topic right now. Everyone really buzzing around that, and the pros and the cons, and certainly the costs involved. Very timely and whatnot. Wish to GEE and our Austrian affiliate for collaborating on this effort. You have two very strong affiliates of IAEE, and we're grateful for all of your support. For those listening, this webinar has been recorded, will be available on our Rewind station on our website. Please don't hesitate to tell your friends and colleagues of its existence. It's an open access format. As a reminder, if you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. Visit us at www.iaee.org. Thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.